Good morning. I want to examine the attitude of the media and some, particularly Westminster politicians, towards not only those less fortunate and most vulnerable in our society, but others that they want to keep in their place. And contrary to what you may reflect upon, what you're about to hear over the next few minutes, I do feel relatively well qualified to speak on that subject. I say that because I am a politician, I am a Scot, and I was someone who spent 30 years in the field of journalism. So I think I've experienced firsthand the way in which the press and some amongst the political class conduct themselves, and been on the receiving end of that. Did I always grasp the true nature of sections of the media and the harm they do? Probably I didn't. Not until I got elected, but then quite quickly. As a hack, you tend to view journalism from a journalist's perspective, predictably. You don't see the damage that newspapers and other forms of media can inflict upon people. Getting a story is what matters. But within weeks of being elected, I was given a very, very rude awakening. For the formal opening of Parliament, MSPs are entitled to nominate what's called a local hero. And that's someone who's done great things in their community. They get invited along to the state opening of Parliament as the MSP's guest. I chose a young abroad woman who had conquered drug addiction and not only got her life back on track, but decided to put those experiences to use. She's volunteering locally and going to Edinburgh to help sex workers try and overcome their addiction problems. It's a good, positive tale, or so I thought, but not as far as one newspaper was concerned. They ran the story as drug addict to be MSP's guest at Parliament opening, and dug up the fact that she'd been up in court for theft at the height of her drug use many years earlier. That young woman was left distraught. Her family were outraged. She asked me, am I ever going to be allowed to move on in my life? Did we complain about it? No, we didn't. There was no point. The story was actually factually accurate. She was a drug addict. She had been up in court. They just simply slanted it in the most negative way possible to meet an agenda. Now that's of course, a fairly localised and relatively minor example of media behaviour. At national level, it is far, far worse and occurs far more frequently. But should we really be surprised about that? The British media is owned by the rich and delivered largely by the middle class. It's a middle class that mostly does not connect with the poorest or most vulnerable in our society. OK, for a spell they were fixated with bankers and crooked MPs, but in no time at all it was back to those on benefits, attacking immigrants and demonising Muslims, with opposing press regulation providing a slight interlude. A recent example of that came from The Sun. It was headlined, "Shirking 9 to 5", and the story went on to reveal details of a pilot project which will see jobless people required to attend what are termed job centre classrooms, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. And in addition to the headline, the article referred to those concerned as the shameless sector of society and says job centres will demand that the feckless take part. It's the language, it's the presentation, it creates an image that everyone who's unemployed is at it. We've also, of course, all seen the articles in tabloid newspapers about two parents and 10 kids living in a council house, and the council's had to knock through walls to merge two council houses to accommodate them, and they're living on benefits. And then we've all heard the stories about 3 generations of families, none of whom have worked. What these articles never actually contain are the stats on that. In reality, the number of 12-member families that are living in 2 houses knocked together is absolutely minuscule. And it's the same for the numbers of 3 generations of families who are in that position. But why let the facts get in the way of attacking spongers? And then, of course, there's the issue of the failure of newspapers to examine the issue of who's actually receiving benefits and recognising that huge numbers of people in that position are actually in work. They're the in-work poor whose wages are so low they have to get benefits to top that up. It is about divide and conquer, one might argue, both for the right wing in politics and sections of the mainstream press. And it's not only the written press. Earlier this year, Newsnight was forced to apologise to a young woman by the name of Sinead Thorpe for misrepresenting her in a package they ran. The piece inferred that Miss Thorpe, a single mum, had chosen to move out of her mother's 2-bedroom flat, an action which would lead to requiring housing benefit. Miss Thorpe was portrayed as an unemployed benefit scrounger. She was even asked why she'd chosen to keep her child. She is in fact a working mum who has worked from the age of 16, and the only financial support she gets is towards her rent because she needs it. So what possesses the press to support the agenda of the right wing of politics? I would argue it's their way of ensuring the established order remains. Let me be clear, as a politician, I would welcome reform of the benefit system. It needs reforming. But reform should mean improving, making it more appropriate, not simply slashing funding, which is what's happened when benefit changes have been made for as long as I can remember. This country, the UK, treats millions of carers utterly appallingly in terms of providing support. Personally, I want to see a benefit system that puts that right. And yes, at the same time, I would hammer those found to be abusing it. But just as we should not be coming away with a sweeping generalisation and branding those on benefit scoundrels, so we cannot ignore the fact that there are people seeking to abuse the system. As an MSP, I've seen cases of that. So there is an issue of abuse in the system, and we should tackle that. But just because a few folk are at it, doesn't mean that we should act as the coalition government has and implement measures that are causing hardship for tens of thousands of people. The Scottish Government at the moment has a commission looking at how we might shape a benefit system for an independent Scotland, one which represents traditional Scottish values of fairness. I hope within that we find a way to better support those deserving of support, and clearly I hope we have the opportunity to implement such a system. The treatment of those in genuine poverty in this country by some in the media and politics, and its impact is perhaps most accurately summed up in the executive summary of Oxfam's Our Economy Towards a New Prosperity, where it's stated, experiencing poverty in this rich country is intensely stressful. Stigmatisation through media and political rhetoric adds to individuals' sense of anguish and isolation. They, not society, nor the economy, are blamed for the poverty. Meanwhile, pressures to consume abound in a culture that elevates status and image above relationships, community contribution, or care for the environment. Now, we know why the right wing of politics attacks the poor. They're playing to a constituency whose views of the less fortunate are less than charitable and can easily be stoked up by creating fears. So why in reality do the press do it? In part, it's lazy, easy-hit journalism. The media is much less well-resourced than it once was, and the pressure on fewer staff to deliver the same volume of output is enormous. Now, I'm not anti-media. Some of my best friends are journalists. And indeed, a few months ago in a parliamentary debate on press reform, I actually spoke for strong reform. I did so with the support of the National Union of Journalists, who I consulted beforehand, because there is a very intimidatory atmosphere in some newsrooms now. A bullying culture in some instances, particularly for young journalists. So there are difficulties that journalism face at the moment. But also, we have to be real about this. In some cases, journalists simply don't understand the subject they're tackling or bother to develop an understanding of it. In other cases, we have editors, ordinary journalists and commentators who share the agendas of the titles they work for. And of course, that's not simply confined to labelling those in poverty as scoundrels or a burden on society. Given overseas aid, immigration and Muslims in our communities are also targeted. So let's examine those in order. There's been a spat down south between England's Charity Commission and the Daily Telegraph over the way in which an article on £20 million worth of emergency committee disaster aid it was funding for the Syria crisis appeal was slanted. The ECC chairman, William Shawcross, had, in the course of addressing the organisation's AGM, made a comment in which he acknowledged that inevitably a proportion of such aid might make its way into the hands of terror groups. He was simply admitting that in a crisis situation, try as you might, you cannot remove the risk that some of the money could fail to serve its intended purpose. An acknowledgement which fell some way short of the headline, and I quote, "Charity millions going to Syrian terror groups," and an opening paragraph which stated, "People giving money to help millions of refugees from the civil war in Syria are inadvertently supporting terrorism, the charity watchdog has warned." Then we have immigration. You'll have followed the coverage of this subject over recent months about foreigners coming into the UK in droves and either taking jobs from the indigenous population or being benefit tourists. If anybody tuned into Newsnight last night, they may have seen a rant from Nigel Farage along those lines. But of course, the impact of immigration was put into proper perspective this week with the publication of the Centre for Research and Analysis of Migration report into the fiscal effects of immigration to the UK. And it's worth looking at their conclusions. Immigrants to the UK since 2000 have made a substantial contribution to public finances. Most have, in fact, contributed more in taxes than they have received in benefit over the last decade. Migrants are estimated to have made a net contribution of £25 billion to the UK economy since 2000. Immigrants who arrived after 1999 were 45% less likely to receive state benefits or tax credits than UK natives between 2000 and 2011. They were also 3% less likely to live in social housing. And so it goes on, explanation after explanation of why UKIP and their likes are wrong. You might have thought that would stop the usual suspects in their tracks, but not a bit of it. The online version of one very right-wing title headlined their coverage of the Cream report, and I quote, "How migrants from outside Europe leave a £100 billion black hole in the public purse. Amount taken in benefits and services 14% higher than money put back in." Of course, I may have missed UKIP accepting the report shows that they've been spectacularly wrong on this subject and wish to apologise. But I suspect, given Mr Farage's rant last night, that's a bit unlikely. We should not lose sight of the fact there is out there an ignorance of the important contribution migrants make, whether they settle here permanently or perhaps come and go seasonally. And people will seek to play upon that. A little while back, during a Westminster election campaign, the SNP locally in Angus surveyed Arbroath residents on which reserved matters were most important to them. The process threw up a fascinating discrepancy. Certainly at that time, there were more migrant workers staying on one side of the town compared to the other. And interesting, in the area where there were fewest immigrants, immigration was flagged up as a major concern, a major issue amongst the reserve powers. In the area where they were mostly living, it hardly featured at all. In other words, where locals could see for themselves how hard the migrants were working, how they conducted themselves, and the type of people they actually were, they didn't see these folks' presence in our community as problematic. But there is clearly, even in Scotland, where we would consider ourselves, I think, a nation to be a bit more tolerant than others, an opening there for those who want to create division, an opportunity to play on concerns. And they, those sections of the press and politics which are so inclined, will exploit that. Because as long as the more fortunate are focusing their anger on those on benefits, or we're blaming immigration for unemployment, the establishment can continue in its merry way. Then, of course, we have the treatment of Muslims. A Cardiff University study of almost 1,000 newspaper articles published about British Muslims between 2000 and 2008 found that more than a quarter portrayed that religion as, and I quote, dangerous, backward and irrational, with references to radical Muslims outnumbering references to moderate Muslims by 17 to 1. Lord Leveson, in his report into the culture and practice and ethics of the press, said, and I quote, "The identification of Muslims as the targets for press hostility was supported by the evidence seen by the inquiry." Mind you, you didn't have far to look for evidence of that. Not when you have headlines such as, "BBC puts Muslims before you," it was the Daily Star in October 2008. "Muslims tell us how to run our schools," the Daily Express in February 2007. Or a Daily Mail columnist who in January 2011 talked of Muslim sexual predators targeting non-Muslim girls out of religious animosity. Why is it the press in this country is able to brand one religious group in this manner? Could you imagine the furore if this sort of thing was said about either of the two established religions in the UK? Of course, much of this stuff refers to the situation in England, but I want to bring it closer to home and return to my starting point when I talked about how, as a Scot, as a nationalist, I found myself and my convictions on the receiving end of this approach. Scotland's been told for years by unionist politicians that we're too poor and we're too stupid to be an independent nation. Then came the revelations when papers were released under the 30-year rule that the then UK government in the 70s had lied about the true wealth of North Sea oil for fear it would encourage Scotland to go it alone. Now, you might have thought that would give the media pause for thought. If the UK government lied then, it might be lying now when it said we couldn't afford to do it. But not a bit of it. They continued to carry scaremongering story after scaremongering story. But then came the point when confronted by their own GERS figures. Now, for anybody who doesn't know what the GERS figures are, every year the UK government produces figures which show how much Scotland paid into the UK, how much it got back. It was revealed that for the last 30 years, for each of the last 30 years, we've paid in more than we've got back, culminating in 2 years ago when it was the equivalent of £824 for every man, woman and child, about £4.4 billion. Now that caused the Better Together campaign a problem. How could you say Scotland was too poor to go it alone? So they changed tack and started saying, we're not saying Scotland couldn't afford to be independent, just that we shouldn't be independent. It was a major change. Again, one you might have thought would have had the media saying, well, wait a minute here. But no, the media, with one or two honourable exceptions, remains complicit in helping the No campaign, providing a barely questioning or challenging platform for their claims, whilst never hesitating to question anything Yes puts forward. If No says something, that runs barely challenged. If Yes says something, you can be sure Better Together will be given the chance to attack that. But it actually goes a little bit deeper and a little bit more worrying than that. You might be aware of the case of Lucinda Crichton, Ireland's European Minister, who was interviewed by the BBC on the subject of an independent Scotland's membership of the EU. The interview, which aired, appeared to shoot down the assertions of the Scottish Government on this subject. But lo and behold, Miss Crichton revealed it had been cut in such a way that she had been left feeling misconstrued, spun and manipulated. A complaint over that incident is presently being investigated by the BBC Trust. Now, we would say that's an example of bias. Interestingly, I think it was an Oxford University report says that the BBC is institutionally pro the establishment. It believes that its role is to support the existing order. It's an interesting point. Now, of course, some of you may be sitting there thinking he does like his conspiracy theories. But remember, not only am I a nationalist, I was a hack for 30 years. I know how the game works. I still have contacts in journalism. So, for example, I can tell you that when the chairman of one well-known Scottish newspaper group realised, and it seems to have come as a surprise to him, that the SNP actually intended pursuing a referendum, his response was, and I quote, "Independence over my dead body." I can also tell you that the editors and political editors of Scottish titles have been invited to Number 10 on numerous occasions, and this was round about a year ago, to be given their marching orders, advised how they might help undermine the Yes campaign. Now, I realise that throughout this contribution, it might appear that I've hammered the press and let the politicians off lightly, but I am not poacher turned gamekeeper. Like the majority of people in this room, I suspect, I balk at the conduct of the coalition government as it pursues the poor and in seeking to keep the UKIP threat at bay, lurches to the right in immigration. I also balk at being lectured in the Scottish Parliament by the Labour Party on child poverty when they had 13 years at Westminster where the powers to address that issue really lie and did little or nothing with them. I would argue we need a new way forward in politics, one the media has no option but adapt to. And the opportunity to bring that about comes in September of next year. The referendum offers us the chance of meaningful change. Remember, voting yes isn't a vote for a party. It simply opens the way to a new order. Each and every party following a yes vote will have to put forward its views, its vision for a new independent Scotland. And then in 2016, we'll vote on that. I might get kicked out, you know. That's the reality. People will have a choice then to shape a new country. There's no question Scotland can afford to be independent. In fact, we can't afford not to be. The question is, do we want it to be? If in possession of all the facts you conclude that whilst we could thrive, but you'd rather be part of the UK, that's a perfectly reasonable position to take. But remember what a no vote means, what having had the chance of change and not taking it, you'd be signing up to. Remaining in the fourth most unequal society in the developed world, remaining part of a country which cuts support for the poor whilst allowing companies and wealthy individuals to dodge tax, the continuing demonisation of a sector of society on grounds of their religion, and regarding immigration as a dirty word, when in Scotland we actually need to attract skilled, hard-working individuals to our land. The choice is ours. We can be better than this if we choose to be. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Do you think that instead of the government blaming people on benefits or migrant workers for UK debt, they should look at unnecessary spending that they've decided this is what we need, costing taxpayers millions every year, like example the Olympics?
There's an argument for that. Personally, there's a greater argument for abolishing trident nuclear weapons as a starting point. You know, I think that's true. To be fair to the coalition government, they inherited a financial mess. It was meltdown. They had to take some difficult decisions. Consequences of that, the Scottish Government had £1,000 million cut from its budget. Consequences of that is we then can't fund some of the things we were funding to the extent we were. So, yes, we need to look at our priorities, but it's also about how you view society, what's important to you. The rhetoric on benefits, I'm 51 years old, I can remember a fair way back, has always been cut, cut, cut. I think we need to look at redistribution on benefits. As I said, carers, for example, are paid a pittance. It's a scandal, it's a disgrace, and we need to find a way to tackle that.
Like you mentioned, recent laws made in Scandinavian countries that any claims made by newspapers are they're deemed to be false have to be retracted on the front page, as in actually the retractions have to be
Has to be prominent.
Yeah. It recognises that most impressions from tabloid newspapers actually do come just from the sensationalist headline. So my question to you is, how would you feel if similar legislation was made in Scotland?
Obviously, I wouldn't be averse to it, and can I tell you, a lot of journalists wouldn't be averse to that. Don't get the impression that all journalists, contrary perhaps to what I've said, are bad. The vast majority are hard-working, diligent people. They want to write the truth, but the pressures on newspaper journalists are horrendous. Before I made that speech, I met with the NUJ to see if my knowledge of what was still going on in newspapers was accurate. It was absolutely accurate. So yes, I would like to see proper prominence given to apologies, because at the moment they bury them away inside the paper. The damage has been done. The lasting memory has been created by that headline. And even if it's a retraction is read, it's tiny type stuck away inside the paper. So yeah, I think it's quite a good idea.
Where does SNP stand on zero-hour contracts? Because it's just forcing more and more people into poverty. They're being forced to come off benefits to get a contract. They go into a contract, in a lot of cases they're getting 20 hours of work a week, which isn't enough to keep anyone. Would the SNP ban the zero-hour contract?
This came up in the Scottish Parliament yesterday, and the Deputy First Minister challenged anyone who had knowledge of this going on in the public sector to come to us, because we know it is a growing problem and it's something that needs to be tackled. Where we can directly tackle it, we're trying to do that. There are some difficulties with other areas of the public sector, but we are determined to address that.
Someone was aware then, say for instance it was their child that was in this situation where they have no chance then of getting their own place to live, they're going to have to stay with their parent. I mean, I'm talking about a child at the age of 26, for instance. If a letter was put into the SNP government, would that be looked at?
But to be accurate, we can control what happens in the public sector directly. We can do that. If it's the private sector, it's more difficult. You can complain to them, raise the issue. As a local MSP, I'd be happy to do that. But in terms of what the government can directly influence, it is the public sector.
I'm not really sure about this vote for independence and that, because I actually don't have enough information. I don't know where to go for it. Can you point me in the right direction so I can help me with a couple of
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say to you that we've been trying very hard for the last year and a half to get that information out. One of the problems with the media, they don't actually want to put it out there. On the 28th of November, there's a document going to be published. It's about yay thick. It's the white paper on independence. It will have absolutely everything, from pensions right the way through, explaining what the vision is and how it would work. I'm told it takes about 8 hours to read, so good luck. It will be published on the 28th. If you really want to get one, give me a shout and I'll get you one to read. Right? And it'll be on, more at the point, it'll be online. That'll be the easiest way to do it. You will have access to it, no problem at all. That's going to be the big launch on the 28th of this month. Anybody else? Sorry.
Can I ask that you ensure that the link to that document is posted on the Social Science website?
That's easily done.
Could you do that? That would be great.
Speak to Cherry about that so you can get that. And of course, there's access to the other side of the argument as well through the Better Together website, so you get a balanced view. So.
Would you say one of the biggest prime opponents, not just to yes or no to a Scottish referendum, but the entire debate itself? Because I don't know about everybody here, but for the past year or so, I've never seen much discussion about the referendum at all. There's nothing on TV. I mean, yes, it's been more discussed now on radio and certain interviews, but there's no been, debates or documentaries. The only thing I've ever heard about referendum was a vote against it in a thing in the mail, like a wee card from the Scottish Labour Party. What efforts is the Scottish Government, maybe particularly the SNP, doing to address the referendum to individuals on the street?
Well, in terms of the debates, there have actually been debates on television. There was actually a documentary series. I should say STV have been first class in their coverage of the referendum, and very fair and even-handed, as they should be. I think there has been a number of debates on the BBC as well, on BBC Two, Newsnight linked debates, studio debates, audience participation debates. So there have been a number. I would expect that to rise as we head towards the referendum. A government can't force the media to engage in it, you know, and particularly the television media, but there have been discussions with the BBC in particular at governmental level about how they approach this issue. And one of the complaints I've had and I've raised formally is that the BBC in Scotland are investing less and less in television hours. Now, I find that bizarre at a time where the most historic decision we've taken in hundreds of years is around the corner, and yet they're not investing resources in this country. And of course, what you then get is UK-based coverage of it. And I always remember the night that we announced the referendum really would happen, and Jeremy Paxman, who I have enormous respect for, going into meltdown on Newsnight as he listed all the things that would change if Scotland became independent, and the punchline was, and even the BBC would have to change its name. And I think that's the level of contribution we've had from the UK, and I think that needs to change. So I think the answer is there has been some, there's going to be more.
Can you tell me, why was the voting age actually reduced to 16? And also, even though they've reduced it to 16, like my son is at high school, he's not been given any additional information. He can come to me and speak to me. But, you know, 16 years old. Okay,
16-year-old, we believe that 16-year-olds should have the vote in all elections. This is the only one we can make that decision on. The decision on the voting age for every other election, even Scottish elections, is determined by the UK government. So why do we believe it's important? This is a huge decision for our country. Why should a 100-year-old have the right to vote when, with due respect, they won't really be around to see the consequences of the decision if we deny the 16-year-old who will be? We believe that if you're old enough to pay tax, etc., you should have the right to vote in something that's important. In terms of the information, there is a problem there. Both campaigns have got material to go out to schools. Some of the schools seem reluctant to engage in this. There have been a number of votes taken in schools, but there's been no effort made to bring politicians from both sides of the argument in to actually be grilled, which I find quite astonishing, to be honest.
Because they've got such a lack of information, and at 16, I can only speak from being a parent of a 16-year-old, whilst he's intelligent and articulate, he doesn't understand fully the consequence of voting yes or no. And how's that going to impact on, say, a large turnout of 16-year-olds does happen, and it's just a yes or a no because it's new to them?
I mean, it's a point, but I would say to you that there is a percentage of the electorate who've that approach to voting anyway, the existing electorate. This issue came up at a thing I did at a high school in Angus about a year ago, about the votes for 16. And the deputy rector said she was appalled at the thought of these people pointing to her pupils having the right to determine the future of their country. And my answer to her was, well, our generation's done a great job, haven't we? You know, nuclear weapons, an economy that's screwed, etc., etc., etc. I think we should trust young people to have their say. I think they're entitled to have their say on this.
But as MSP for our area, can you not actually write out to our high schools? Or
Can I tell you something? I have enough difficulty getting into some of the schools to talk about my work, to talk about my environment committee work. I've written to every school in Angus offering to come and talk to them on whatever subject. It's up to the individual rectors. It's not an education authority thing, it's the individual rectors have the right to determine. I'd be interested to hear, once we've finished this, which school we're talking about. For example, I'm going to speak at Arbroath Academy in a few weeks' time. I've been at Arbroath High every year, so, you know.
We'll go into the high school and speak about...
I was there a few months ago. Now that was to talk about my work as an MSP, but inevitably the kids want to talk about the referendum, so I'm more than happy to answer those questions.
I think the Yes campaign is actively trying to kind of create that kind of block against schools by running stories, you know, about how the SNP are manipulating 16-year-olds? Because I have seen a few of those stories in tabloids.
Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah, I've also seen the supposed evidence that says that the school votes that have been taken have been very anti the Yes campaign.
Yeah, it's like an active movement by by the No campaign, to try and create that kind of disillusionment.
I think the media have certainly tried to tap into that, but the reality may be somewhat different. I don't know. So you wanted to ask something?
Because you mentioned immigration and similar. I'm an immigrant myself. Obviously, I've been here for over 7 years now. First of all, I've noticed in politics in in the United Kingdom, there is a lot of people have strong sentiments against immigration. I can understand that. Obviously, I haven't heard so many politicians openly defending immigration. Talking about how good it is for the economy, at least in my opinion, or whatever. I haven't heard that much of it. But as far as I know, me and other immigrants, we are allowed to vote in the referendum. And I was just wondering what is SNP's position on immigration in general, and has it considered addressing or going forward to speak to immigrants, because it's a sizable minority, Polish or whatever. Sorry, and I'll just tell you from my own experience that a lot of people, they're not informed about it at all, and a lot of them are also concerned what will happen if Scotland goes independent, what will happen to their rights, to their situation here in Scotland. And
I've repeatedly heard SNP politicians talking positively about immigration. We need immigration in Scotland, that's the reality. In terms of how we engage, I can't speak for the No campaign. I can tell you the Yes campaign has prepared materials in multi-languages. We're also looking at the software which will allow us to identify by name the likely ethnic source of these individuals. That's not an exact science, but we're trying to do that. So what was your last point?
Well, basically, SNP has a stance and is considering this.
Well, in terms, I'm sorry.
Part of its campaign.
As far as, and it's not the SNP, it's the Yes campaign. Can I tell you the Yes campaign has got Labour Party members, it's got some Conservatives in it, and people who have no political allegiance. Our view going forward is we absolutely are pro-immigration. Now, one might argue that the biggest challenge on immigration lies in perhaps what happens in another referendum, which is the UK's referendum that they are planning to have on EU membership. Because if there is a no vote on EU membership, the change that will make to immigration to the UK, if we're still part of the UK, will be horrendous. Because the free movement that we have now will go out the window. And if Scotland's an independent country and the rest of the UK then votes to go out of Europe, we'll have free borders, but we will have to have a border with England because they voted to come out of the EU. That's the biggest challenge in immigration. EU voted immigration.
So independence on its own will not affect immigrants in Scotland?
Not at all. Not in a negative way.
Yeah. Okay.
Although, always, as I've said, we do need to change some attitudes towards immigrants in our country, because we would be kidding ourselves on if we thought we were a perfect society. We do not have a bad attitude towards immigration in some quarters.
What happens to the SNP or the Scottish Parliament if after the vote it has been decided that they don't want to have independence? What is the future for Scottish politics, really?
Sorry, what's the future what?
What's the future for Scottish politics and for the SNP if after this vote that you've been voted?
If you put forward a proposal in a democratic referendum and you lose, you have to accept the outcome of it. We would continue with devolution as it is, and in 2016 you guys get the chance to vote and decide whether we've done a good job in government and re-elect us or kick us out. That's what happens.
Yeah, but does that then mean that Westminster now think that there's no need for a Scottish Parliament? Or
Well, I don't know. I don't think they would do that. There is the Better Together parties tell you that if we vote no, they'll think about more powers. I would have serious doubts about that. There is a concern that they will try to claw back some of the powers. I don't think anybody would suggest they would abolish the Scottish Parliament. That would be very counterproductive. Put me out of work as well.
I was just wondering what would happen if, you know, because it must be a real concern what happens to a Scottish Parliament and to the SNP once, you know, because it seems, I know you're saying it's all these other parties are, you know, they are part of this Yes campaign, but it seems to be a mostly SNP driven.
Yeah, absolutely, but that's democracy. You cannot.
Yeah,
I mean,
totally.
that's the reality. My own view is that the Scottish Parliament will continue pretty much as it is. I think it will be a bad thing in the long term, but I would say that. But I don't think it's Armageddon.
They're actually going to stay in power for what, another 2 years after?
We get on with government. Can I tell you that in Canada, the Quebec Separatist Party runs Quebec and has lost, I think, it's 2 referendums in total. That's the reality. You have to accept the democratic will of the people, even if you think they got it wrong. Sorry?
Are they listening to the Scottish people if they do lose the vote?
How, in what sense?
Well, if they lose the vote and they've went for independence, should they step down?
Not at all. We're the elected, democratically elected government of Scotland, and in 2016 we'll stand again on a platform of policies, and if people vote for us, they vote for us. If they don't, they don't. I mean, that's, you know, this is not, independence is a central platform of the SNP, but we've been re-elected to govern since 2007 on what we achieved as a devolved government, on the policies we had. In a way, it's 2 different things. So we'll see what happens. I still think we'll win, I have to say.